Good afternoon, everyone. So we're going to start up our webinar. Welcome to the Energy Electric Vehicle webinar series, where we'll be discussing the unintended risk of current electric vehicles policy and the better alternatives. We're joined with Dr. Rapson from UC Davis. My name is Saad Maiman. I'm currently a student at the Bauer College of Business, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we begin this event, I just want to take a minute to thank our partner, Evolve Houston. We're so glad that they're working with us to help provide Estonians with reliable alternatives to transportation to accelerate clean vehicle transportation through electrification. To learn more about the webinar series UH host, please visit the website. The link should be in the chat for you guys, where we have multiple past webinars that we've had and all the different great speakers. Moving forward, we're going to have a Q&A session after this webinar, after the live webinar, where you guys can give us all the questions, so please hold on to those. And we will be utilizing the chat feature that you should see on your right side. You guys can go ahead and send in the questions during the presentation or after the presentation, and we'll go from there and answer those questions with you. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Rapson, who is a professor of economics and the director of Davis Energy Economics Program at the University of California, Davis. Dr. Rapson studies how firms and consumers make decisions primarily about energy use and what this implies for optimal regulation and government policies. Active research topics include electric vehicle, electricity markets, and pricing and climate policy. His research appears in the American Economic Reviews, Science, Nature, and journals. Without further ado, let's start this presentation. You can take over, Dr. Rapson.
Thank you very much, Saad. Okay, just getting used to this new interface here. Okay, so this is great. I'm really delighted to be included in this speaker series. Thank you very much for inviting me to do this. I'm here today to talk about electric vehicle policy, which is something that has taken a central position in climate change mitigation efforts and has implications for our economy broadly, as well as obviously specific aspects of the economy. And today I'm going to talk about some of those things. So I'm going to start by reviewing some of the goals of transportation electrification. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the policies that have been implemented to promote the adoption of electric vehicles. There is some ongoing research I have that is asking a potentially provocative, but I think quite important question, which is, are electric vehicles substitutes for gasoline cars? And we haven't fully answered that question. And of course, everything's changing, but I think there's some interesting insights that I'd like to share with you. And then I'm going to zoom out and just give my own perspective on what this evidence tells us about where we should be in terms of electric vehicle policy. And I very much look forward at the end of that to an extended Q&A. I'm going to try to keep my slides and talk to about 30 minutes, so there's lots of time for us to interact afterwards, which is always the most fun. So transportation is a major source of greenhouse gas emissions in the world. I'm sure that most people who are here probably have already come to understand that. In this graph, what I'm showing is the greenhouse gas emissions by sector globally. And you can see that transportation is the second highest contributor to greenhouse gases in the world as of the printing of this graph. It's still true, and it's growing. That means that, to the extent we are trying to, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, the transportation sector is a very important one to focus on. The largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions is electricity and heat, but electricity is we have a pretty clear line of sight to how we would like to decarbonize the electric grid, and so that interacts with the aspirations that are becoming widespread around shifting transportation from liquid fossil fuels like gasoline and diesel onto electricity that's generated from renewable sources. I, sometimes hesitate to even put up this ridiculous pie graph, but I just want to highlight how ubiquitous gasoline technology is in our transportation system today. This is a pie chart of the composition of the U.S. vehicle fleet in 2020, and it's basically 98 to 99% gasoline. So when we talk about electrifying transportation, we're really talking about converting this entire sector of the economy from one technology to another technology. This is a very ambitious aspiration that is being held. And of course, this graph is for the United States, but basically it's the same if we were to show this for the world. And so the electrification vision essentially has two components to it. The first is that we want to take all of these fossil fuel electricity generators, coal and natural gas, and we want to convert them to renewable, either wind or solar, or hydro, potentially some nuclear in there. But basically, we want to get off of the fossil fuels. And after doing that, the idea is that then you can get rid of gasoline-powered cars and instead charge your vehicles on this nice, clean electricity, thereby decarbonizing transportation. So that's the vision. Now, I would like to point out that this aspect of it, there's a timing issue here, which is that if we want to decarbonize, it's really important to get rid of in particular, the coal on the grid before we shift from gasoline to electric vehicles. Otherwise, we're just powering our transportation from coal or even natural gas instead of from gasoline. And that's not really doing us all that much good when it comes to carbon. Gasoline or natural gas is going to be an improvement, but coal actually is not really an improvement. So there's a timing issue there. And as it turns out, this is, I was hoping to be able to walk through a little build here, but what I had here was two different graphs, and I'll just present the one that ended up being on top here, which is the generation mix for ERCOT, which is the Texas electricity grid. And it's approximately, pretty similar actually to what the grid is globally, which is to say there's a lot of coal and natural gas, about 20% coal, 35% natural gas. You guys have a lot of wind on there and some nuclear. Worldwide, coal is just a little bit higher and gas is substantially higher, and the mix of renewables is very different worldwide. But basically, this is the story. We've got about 60% of global electricity coming from fossil fuels, and in different areas of the world and different areas of the United States, this generation mix can vary dramatically. And I'm going to show you some evidence of that in a minute. So when we think about an effective emissions reduction strategy for transportation, the number one thing, this might seem obvious, but the number one thing we want to do is reduce pollution. And some of what is happening today in electric vehicle policy is going to be effective in reducing pollution, although cost effectiveness is something that we can talk about. But some of what's happening in EV policy, I would argue, is creating incentives that act in the opposite direction. So what is the direction we want to be pushing in? Well, we want to reduce the number of cars on the road because, manufacturing these vehicles is actually very energy intense. We want to reduce the driving of those vehicles when that driving is powered by fossil fuel energy. And that means either gasoline or coal or gas generated electricity. And for these two reasons, the time and place of electrification are important. In places where the grid has already been decarbonized, great, let's think about pushing electric vehicle technology into those places. In geographies where there's still a lot of coal on the grid, we probably want to wait. So for example, I'm giving this talk right now from my apartment in Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is on the east coast of Canada. Canada in general has a very clean electric grid because we have an abundance of hydropower. But as it turns out, in Nova Scotia, we're about 60% coal. 60% coal. This is a place where we should not be promoting electric vehicles, and yet there is this, very ambitious goal to get people to adopt more EVs here, including, expensive subsidies and whatnot. And these are just not going to have a positive environmental impact. So, we need to keep this pollution reduction goal in mind when we think about what strategy is going to work. The second thing I want to talk about is risk mitigation. And here, I think of this, people often relate to risk mitigation in terms of insurance policies. We all buy insurance for medical care. We buy it for our homes. And this is so that when things that we don't expect to happen, we're covered. We're going to be okay. We're not going to incur really a lot of costs. Well, when it comes to emissions reduction strategies, we want to buy similar insurance. And what is the uncertainty here? Well, the uncertainty is what technology is going to look like in 15 years or 30 years or 50 years. This climate change mitigation is a marathon, right? This is a very long-term goal that humanity has to maintain stable temperatures and climate on the planet. This isn't something we're going to solve this year or in 5 years. It's something that we have to plan today for the next coming decades. And what this includes is some uncertainty, some humility about what technologies are going to arise in the future. Whatever policies we implement today should be able to incorporate technological advancements and new information that we can benefit from in the future, rather than locking us in to technologies that are available today. So I want to introduce a term called technology neutrality. So technology neutral policies are policies that aren't choosing technologies, but are rather making it expensive to pollute and creating the incentives for us to find the technologies that are most advantageous for emissions reductions today and in the future. The final thing is that, we are not operating in North America in a bubble. Climate change is a global problem where the stock of CO2 is a global pollution stock. So 1 ton of emissions from Halifax, Nova Scotia is contributing the same to global climate change as 1 ton emitted from Texas or 1 ton emitted from China, et cetera. So what we really need to think about is global solutions. We have to acknowledge that developing countries are growing economically, and that economic growth is going to be fueled by energy demand, some of which is probably going to be met by fossil fuels. So we need to find solutions here that are going to be cost effective there. And so these are some themes I'm going to come back to throughout the talk. Okay, so let's talk about some of the incentives relating to electric vehicle policies. So the first thing I want to show you is a graph from a paper that was just released as a working paper at the National Bureau of Economic Research by a co-author of mine, Eric Muliger. You're going to see his name pop up a lot. In fact, all the work that I've done that I'm going to present here is co-authored with many different people. I'll try to highlight them as I go along. And what this map shows is the cost per mile driven savings if you drive an EV relative to an ICE, an internal combustion engine, or a gasoline car. And what you can see is that in places like California or up in the Northeast, both of which have very expensive electricity, the savings per mile is pretty low, about somewhere in the 15 to 35% variable cost savings for driving a Nissan Leaf relative to a Nissan Versa. Why do I choose a Leaf and a Versa for this comparison? Well, it's because these are basically very similar vehicles, except one of them is powered by electricity, the other is powered by gasoline. It wouldn't be quite a fair comparison if we took a Nissan Leaf and compared it to a Ford F-150, for example. So we're trying to keep as many variables, constant here as possible. And you can see that across the country, the savings is different everywhere. So when you are up in the Pacific Northwest here, electricity prices are not as high, and gasoline prices are high, and so there's a pretty high savings per mile for driving an EV. In Texas, you guys are right in the middle of the pack. It's about half as expensive per mile for driving in an EV than it is in a gasoline car. Now, this is not talking about upfront costs, and it's not talking about environmental damages. These are just the private costs of propelling yourself in one technology versus another. But as it turns out, electric vehicles are actually substantially more expensive, more expensive to manufacture. So this is basically because of the battery technology. Battery costs have come down dramatically, but they still are much more expensive than a plastic gas tank, which is inside which is the equivalent technology in a gasoline car. And so in order to make electric vehicles cost competitive for consumers, many governments, both federal, state, some municipal, are subsidizing EVs to people who want to buy them. And I just want to show you this graph right here, which is a pretty dramatic example of how effective these subsidies can be. So in Georgia, in the state of Georgia, they had a tax credit that gave a few $1,000s, I think it was $5,000 off the cost of an electric vehicle, up until the time when they removed that credit at the end of or at the beginning of 2015. And you can see that electric vehicle sales were rising until that point. Then they got rid of the subsidy, and actually they implemented a small EV registration fee, and EV sales dropped dramatically. Now that since 2018, that's increased a little bit, but this really, I would say, shows that these incentives matter. The upfront cost matters. These subsidies are effective in driving people to purchase more electric vehicles than they would in the absence of the subsidies. One of my biggest pet peeves with the electric vehicle movement is that they're called zero emissions vehicles. Now, of course, when you're thinking about just tailpipe emissions, that's correct. But I think many people have not thought through the fact that it's not just tailpipe emissions that matter. Where the electricity is generated and how it's generated is going to really dramatically change the emissions profile of driving an electric vehicle. And I'm pulling this graph from a really seminal paper by Holland, Manser, Muller, and Yates, where they calculated the costs of the carbon emissions as well as the local criteria pollutant emissions from these technologies, from gasoline or electricity. And these vary dramatically depending on the composition of the electric grid in the United States. So in the West, where there's very little coal, there's more natural gas and a growing amount of renewables, the damage of driving an electric vehicle is actually quite low. But in the Midwest, this can actually be a lot of damage because there's still an abundance of coal generating the electricity that's powering EVs. And coal is not only contributing high amounts of carbon dioxide to the stock of greenhouse gas pollutants, but also it's emitting nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide, and these local pollutants that are contributing to respiratory damage. This is actually very costly, and that's just evidence, as you can see by the scale here. But the grid is getting cleaner, so that's true. When people look at this, they're like, "Oh yeah, but this paper was published in 2016." That's true, but there's still a lot of coal on the grid in 2021 in the Midwest. And I would say that the general point that's being made by HMMY is still true today, which is it's much dirtier to drive an electric vehicle in the South and the Midwest than it is in the West. This matters. It means that, if we're promoting electric vehicles nationwide, some of them are going to go to places where we're getting a lot of environmental benefit. Some are going to go to places where we're actually creating net environmental harm. That's something we should care about. So the government has, a suite of policy options, and I want to put them into 3 buckets for you because I think that it's really important, the choice that governments make about how to promote this technology. The first thing that governments can do is do nothing. And I'm not going to talk much about this because I think this is reckless. When you've got a market failure, which is what happens when you have, externalities like pollution, emissions that are being generated kind of outside of the private transaction that's happening between buyers and sellers, governments have a role to improve the public good by intervening. The suite of policies that governments have available to them roughly fall into 2 buckets. They're what I call direct policies. So these are subsidies, bans, and mandates. And there's pricing, which is making it more expensive to pollute. These pricing policies are not addressing technology. So they're not, saying we need more electric vehicles to the exclusion of other, low pollution technologies. What it's saying is that, we're going to make it expensive to pollute, and we're going to allow firms and consumers then who are facing these incentives, which make it more expensive to buy, say, gas guzzling gasoline cars. They can make their own choice. If it's really valuable for them to have a gasoline car, they can do it, but they're going to pay more. But these subsidies, bans, and mandates turn out to be expensive, they're poorly targeted, and they have a lot of unintended consequences. And unfortunately, when you see policymakers in the United States talking about electric vehicle policy, they're typically talking about these types of direct policies. And I think that that's misguided. I think that it's leading us to a much more risky profile of policies than we would wish if what we care about is climate change mitigation or economic growth. So I just want to, dive a little bit deeper into what I mean by that, in particular with electric vehicle subsidies, because EV subsidies are the most common policy to promote EVs in North America, and I would say also worldwide. So what do you do when you subsidize an EV? Well, you're basically making it less expensive to buy EVs relative to other things you might buy, like gasoline-powered cars. But that's really making it less expensive to have cars in general, right? It's not any more expensive under an EV subsidy to buy a gasoline car, right? So, and it's less expensive to buy an electric car. So that makes it, that increases the supply of cars on the road. And I'm actually going to show you later in this presentation some evidence that that's exactly what's going on. When you subsidize electric vehicles, it doesn't create any incentive to reduce driving in gasoline cars. In fact, it might actually promote driving in gasoline cars if it's driving down the price of oil, right? Making gasoline cheaper. Subsidizing electric vehicles does nothing to promote driving electric vehicles where the grid is clean, right? It's if you get a $7,500 federal electric vehicle subsidy and you're driving in California, then that subsidy is creating emissions abatement. But if you're driving it in Chicago, it's not, right? You're probably powering that with coal electricity in Chicago. So these EV subsidies they're promoting driving in areas with coal electricity, which is exactly the opposite of what we want to do. There's some cool research out there by people, Mark Jacobson and Arthur Van Bentham, who showed that when you basically force more clean cars into the market, it creates a scarcity in old gas guzzlers, and that makes them more valuable. When there's scarcity in a market, the price of that commodity goes up. That's true for used vehicles as well. And they find that we should expect old gasoline cars to live longer if all we're doing is subsidizing EVs. And then when we zoom out and we look at a worldwide kind of view of this, if the US were to successfully electrify transportation, that would dramatically reduce the demand for oil worldwide and drive down the price of oil. And then, I would be concerned that this creates an incentive for developing countries to their main transportation fuel, eroding some of the environmental benefits of reducing emissions domestically. So these are some of the unintended consequences of subsidizing EVs, and I think that they're not well enough understood. Okay, so why don't we just ban gasoline cars? Forget about subsidizing them, just ban them. Well, there's a really nice paper, again, by Holland, Manser, and Yates, where they kind of dig into the economics of this. The short story is bans and mandates are only really good when you're mandating, something that's a technology that's obviously dramatically better than another technology and is almost, completely being adopted anyway. So the only buyers who aren't buying that good are making mistakes. I would say this does not characterize the vehicle mix in the US or world today. There just really are genuine massive economic benefits to driving gasoline cars relative to electric vehicles. If we banned those, there'd be pretty dramatic economic consequences. Okay, are electric vehicles substitutes for gasoline cars? So I'm now going to turn to some research that I'm doing with Fiona Burlig at University of Chicago, Jim Bushnell, my colleague at UC Davis, and Catherine Wolfram, who is at UC Berkeley, but currently working in the Treasury Department under the Biden administration. So what we were seeking to do in this research is to understand how much electric vehicles are being used, how much electricity are they using, and how much are they being driven. And as it turns out, that it's quite difficult to get good information on electric vehicle usage. And the main reason is because there's no point of collection of data on vehicle miles traveled or on electricity charging patterns for EVs. Think about your own home. If you buy an electric vehicle and you bring it back to your house and you plug it into your garage, that electricity use is commingling with all of the other electricity uses in your home. It's in most cases, the vast majority of cases, it's not separately metered. So what we do is we take a sample of millions of households in California. We get their hourly electricity meter data, and we match to that DMV registration record. So we know exactly which households get an electric vehicle and when, and we just look at the change in their household electricity use before and after getting the EV. And what we see is shown in this event study plot here. Before the electric vehicle comes along, basically, the household's electricity usage is just humming along at its average, and then it bumps up by about 0.12 kilowatt hours per hour. This roughly translates into about, as our best guess, 6,700 miles of driving in a battery electric car per year, which is dramatically less than what gasoline powered cars are driven. Now, we had to make some assumptions to get there. There's some controversy about this number. We've replicated this for another major electric utility in California. So we've done it for Pacific Gas and Electric and Southern California Edison, and we're getting roughly the same results. So there's a question that we have, which is, why do we think EVs are being driven less than gasoline cars? And there are a whole bunch of potential explanations. Okay? It could be that the cars that we were looking at have low battery range, and if you simply expand the battery capacity of EVs, that people are going to drive them more. I'm going to show you some evidence in a second about that. Could be that early adopters are different from future adopters. One of the most intriguing hypotheses that we have is that electric vehicles are complements to gasoline cars rather than substitutes. So people like to have them as an extra car, but not as a replacement to their main gasoline vehicle, we're going to show you what we can say about that. Electricity prices in California are extremely high. We actually don't think that this is a huge factor, but when we are, talking to policymakers about electrifying the economy, so moving away from fossil fuels in general, if what we want to do is push people onto electricity, then having very high electricity prices is not desirable. And then, are there other things about electric vehicles that are not desirable that cause people to drive them less? For example, a sparse charging infrastructure could be one thing. So we've been able to mount a little bit of evidence along these lines. So here I'm showing you a plot on the x-axis here. It's showing the battery range in miles of different electric vehicles. So you have plug-in hybrid electrics here, which have very small batteries. You've got the dots in circles are non-Tesla and non-Chevy Bolt battery electric vehicles. These are they power only by electricity. And then you've got the Chevy Bolt and Teslas. And then what we have on the y-axis is the electricity consumption at home, right? This is the home electricity consumption. So we don't actually have a direct line of sight into the away from home charging. And we're just plotting, battery range against how much people are charging at home. And this is intended to test the hypothesis that, it's all about battery range. And what we take away from this graph is, well, really, it doesn't look like people are charging their EVs more as they get more range, except for the Teslas. So there's, potentially Tesla buyers are very different from all other EV buyers in terms of how much they're using their EVs. Or, maybe it is something to do with battery range, and we need to see a, larger distribution of vehicle models in order to test the hypothesis. But we don't think that the evidence to date shows that battery range is the entire reason. We think that there's other stuff going on. What is one of those things we think is going on? Well, we think the vehicle portfolio is important. Okay, so what am I showing you here in this graph? The main takeaway, I'll just give you the takeaway first, and then I'll explain to you why I think this is the case. EVs may be extra cars as opposed to replacement vehicles. Okay, and so what we did is we know we're able to match cars to households in our data for these millions of households. And so we see for every household that buys an electric vehicle, how many cars did they have before they bought the EV? And the answer is, on average, they had about 1.5. How many cars did they have in their portfolio after buying the EV? Well, it's about 2.5, which means that for every time a household buys an EV, the number of cars in their portfolio goes up by almost exactly 1. It's different when you look at gasoline and diesel households. They start with slightly fewer cars to begin with, so maybe somewhere around 1.2 cars per household. They don't have as many cars. And when they buy a gasoline car, the number of cars in their portfolio goes up only by 0.6. That means that 40% of the time when they're buying a gasoline car, it's replacing another car. They're selling another car, but it's not just additional to the portfolio. So gasoline cars are substituting for gasoline cars, but electric cars, at least in California over the period of our sample, which is 2013 to 2019, are not replacing gasoline cars. These are, by and large, additional cars in the portfolio. Right? So EVs are not acting as substitutes. Okay, so let's zoom out and just ease our way into a discussion here. So I want to talk about Norway, because lots of people hold Norway up as a great success story in electric vehicles, and I tend to agree with them. But I want to just highlight what it is that's special about Norway. So Norway does not subsidize EVs, right? This is really important. They do not subsidize EVs. Instead, they have massive taxes on gasoline cars, massive registration fees on gasoline cars that you are exempt from if you buy an electric vehicle. So this is, it might seem like these are the same things, but they really aren't. They're making it very expensive to buy gasoline cars. This is more aligned with a stick approach than a carrot approach, but it does make EVs relatively economical. Why is this beneficial in Norway? Well, it's because they have an extremely clean electric grid. Their electricity comes 98% from hydro generation. So, I think we need to ask the question, is this replicable? Is this replicable in the United States? I would say this part of it is definitely not. We are really very far away from having a 98% renewable grid. Could we get to 50% renewable in the next, decade or two? Maybe we could, although, you guys in Texas have experienced a lot of difficulties with your electric grid as we have in California. And I think, there's a lot of uncertainty about what happens when you go from 20% to 30% renewable, 30 to 40, 40 to 60% intermittent renewable. These are, great aspirations, but we haven't figured it out completely. This part of it, I think we really should adopt, right? We should absolutely be making it much more expensive to drive using polluting technologies. That would make EVs look relatively economical, but it would reduce the incentive to pollute on these other margins. That's a much better policy than what we've been implementing. Excuse me. Okay, there are a bunch of uncertainties I want to highlight. I'm going to try to go through these quite quickly. So, how sure are we that mainstream drivers in the United States are going to adopt electric vehicles? And if they don't adopt them voluntarily, should they be forced to? Okay, we're really confronting some societal issues here. How do we get to 100% renewable electricity? If we don't get to close to 100% renewable electricity, then maybe we should be thinking about extremely fuel efficient gasoline cars as well. How do you appropriately weigh those different options? I just want to remind you today, over 60% of global electricity generation comes from fossil fuels. I am very concerned about macroeconomic effects. So I mentioned this earlier in the talk about what happens if the U.S. stops demanding gasoline or stops demanding crude oil at the levels that it does. It's going to change the price of crude oil globally, and developing countries are going to increase their demand for it. Now, this is, it's a little bit pessimistic in one sense, right? It's very difficult for us to control what happens in the rest of the world, but I think it also points to the types of solutions that are going to be beneficial. We can't just think of ourselves as an island or a bubble when it comes to climate policy. We need to be pursuing policies that are going to help the global, help work towards global solutions, because this is a global problem. You can think of similar effects in the scarcity of raw materials. If we try to get to 100% EVs or a very steep share of solar, are the raw materials required to build those technologies going to be available? I would like to bring a little bit more attention to alternate technologies. I think we need to really be investing in sucking carbon out of the atmosphere using direct air capture. It's also possible that hydrogen, fuel efficiency, cellulosic ethanol are other abatement options that we should be really leaving the door open to. Electric vehicles are really very appealing, and I think they're going to be extremely important going forward, but we don't want to close off these options either. We don't want to close off these other abatement pathways because there are a lot of uncertainties still relating to electric vehicles. So how do we identify and pursue these alternatives with the appropriate level of vigor? My answer would be we need to price carbon. We need to make it expensive to pollute and then allow firms and consumers to figure out what technologies can provide the transportation amenities that we need at the lowest cost after incorporating the costs of pollution. And of course, there are ethical considerations about developing countries. I've kind of mentioned those already. So finally, electric vehicle technology is extremely promising. It's going to be a huge part of the future. And I think we should encourage the adoption of EVs, but we should not do it through these direct policies of subsidies and bans or mandates. We should instead encourage EV adoption through pollution taxes, carbon pricing. That's going to produce the incentives that will allow us to navigate the massive uncertainties that exist relating to renewable energy and relating to technology choices for transportation. So if there are two things that I want you to take away, it's we should minimize the use of subsidies, bans, and mandates, and we need to get the incentives right by using technology neutral emissions policies like pollution pricing. Okay, and I'm going to leave it there. Thanks. I went maybe a slight bit over, but I think we've got 20 minutes now for a discussion, which I very much am looking forward to.
Rapson. Just before we start, let's see, Jesse said the small word hello from Halifax. So, so the first question we go on to is from Ramadan. It says, what will the carbon footprint of the next MWH that will be generated in Nova Scotia? If it is smaller than the carbon footprint of internal combustion vehicles, then it should be promoted even in Nova Scotia. Looking at the overall capacity production and its mix, if it does not provide light on why we should go to EVs.
Okay, so that's a really great question. And sorry, something's popped up here.
Yeah, that's the question.
Yeah, okay. So it's a really great question. So there are kind of two things that I want to focus on here. One is the relative emissions factor of coal-fired electricity relative to gasoline, and the other is cost effectiveness of emissions abatement. So let's take them in that order. When you think about coal-fired electricity, it actually is dirtier than gasoline per mile traveled when you have equivalent vehicles in a climate like Nova Scotia, where there's a lot of cold days. So the charging resistance of the battery increases in cold temperatures, which means you need to cram more kilowatt hours into that battery to get it fully charged. And you're going to be discharging it at a higher rate in cold climates, because whereas with a gasoline car, there's an abundance of waste heat from the combustion, and that's what you use to heat your cabin. But for electric vehicles, you're actually heating your cabin by drawing down the battery for heat. So when coal is charging that battery, it's actually dirtier in a place like Nova Scotia. So temperature actually is a huge factor for the relative emissions benefit. But what if it were the case that you could save, 5% carbon emissions, let's say, from going to coal from gasoline? Should we do it? Well, I would argue, that's a lot less beneficial than if you get 100% abatement, right? So the cost effectiveness of ton of carbon abated really matters, and we shouldn't be willing to pay, just anything we want for a ton of abatement. So, people, I guess there's a term that I'm not sure whether people are familiar with, but it's called the social cost of carbon, and it is the best guess that economists have of the damages and environmentalists have of the damages that are inflicted on the planet from an additional ton of carbon. And currently, I don't know, I think it's probably about $100 per ton. And because I'm an environmentalist, maybe we should spend $200 per ton, to get to get carbon out of the atmosphere. But I don't think we should spend $1,000 per ton or $1,500 per ton. And if all you're getting is a tiny incremental carbon benefit, you really have to think about how much it's costing you to get that. So Ramanan, I hope that answered your question.
All right. Moving on to the next one. With lower income people typically using older gas-powered vehicles, particularly in rural areas where public transportation isn't as common, how will the shift to EVs potentially impact them financially? If we start to get rid of gas stations and internal combustion infrastructure as EVs become more prevalent, Low-income people tend to hold on to vehicles much longer, will be forced to purchase a newer vehicle earlier than they might have to otherwise. Will this need to reinstate significant subsidies?
Sure. Well, it's very important to think about these distributional consequences of policies, and I think fortunately people have been considering distributional consequences a lot more in recent years. When it comes to a stock pollutant like greenhouse gas, it doesn't matter where it's emitted, right? It's a ton of carbon emitted is going to contribute to global warming the same if it comes from a low-income rural area than a high-income urban area. But the same is not true of local pollutants. So, if it's the case that low-income people live in places where the air quality is lower, then shifting emissions away from the tailpipe in those areas could provide them benefits. And the same, we've had a lot of success with local pollution abatement through cap and trade programs in California, for example, which essentially got rid of acid rain in the 1980s. So I think we should be looking towards these types of cap and trade programs to help local air quality in rural areas. But in general, I think that there's an overemphasis on trying to push expensive technologies like electric vehicles into low-income areas. Because as you said in the question, low-income households typically don't buy new cars, they buy used cars, and they're buying older cars. That's because it's more economically accessible to them. I'm not sure that we should try to fix all of the distributional concerns through electric vehicle policy. Rather than subsidize EVs for low-income households, why don't we just give them the money instead? I think that would be a much more efficient policy, allow them to spend it how they want to their highest benefit, and reduce carbon emissions in the most cost-effective way elsewhere in the economy.
Okay. Moving on, next question is, earlier you mentioned, I believe during slide 11, you said it's tailpipe emissions here versus grid emissions over there. Are those quantifiable and relevant?
Oh, they're absolutely quantifiable and relevant. And so the paper that I showed the map where I guess it was maybe slide 11. Holland, Manser, Muller, and Yates in the American Economic Review in 2016 basically did that calculation. They said, what happens when we take, if we were to take somebody driving in LA and shift them from a gasoline car to an electric car? Well, the combustion is going to happen in different places. Instead of coming from the engine in the car in downtown LA, it's going to happen wherever the natural gas plant is firing up to meet the electricity demand from charging. And yeah, so that's exactly the map that I showed you. It's absolutely relevant. In most places in the U.S., there's not a ton of benefit shifting from gasoline cars to electric vehicles when you add up all of the pollutants, because you are shifting a bunch of electricity generation to other areas that you're exposing to local pollution. So you're shifting the environmental damages from one place to another rather than producing really substantial environmental benefits across the board.
Next one is can we get your thoughts on what shifting to EV would mean for the environment where the raw materials are sourced? And do you think that carbon tax policy where products are purchased will be effective in cleaning up raw materials supply chains and the countries they're sourced from?
Do you mind popping that up? Because you
Yes.
broke up just a little bit. I think the sourcing of raw materials is a really big question, and the concerns that I have around that are more about exploitation of labor and the illiberal governments in some of the areas where you're mining things like cobalt. And a carbon tax is going to do nothing to help those problems. And I should say, in this talk and in general, I'm a huge advocate of carbon pricing. I think it is a necessary policy, but I don't think it's sufficient. We need to do other things as well. It doesn't, for example, solve local criteria pollutant problems. It doesn't address market power sufficiently. And it doesn't address things like human rights violations in areas where some of these minerals might be mined. So I think this is an issue. I haven't studied the supply chains of these rare earth minerals enough to have really a very strong view of what should or should not happen, except to say that I think you're identifying a very real concern that I share.
Okay, thank you. Next one is from Gabriel. It says, just before I answer about the carbon pricing, he said, please discuss the rational level to start carbon pricing in the US. If it's $50 per ton and raising it by $10 per ton annually to reach $100 per ton in 5 years, should it be higher, say at least $200 per ton? And will this be enough to penalize internal combustion cars with gasoline and diesel while EVs are exempt?
Yeah, so I love the idea of starting low and building it up. I think that the level ultimately should be motivated by our best estimates of the social cost of carbon. So how much damage is being inflicted by a ton of carbon. If it's $100 a ton, then that's where we should end up. I personally also think that there's some insurance that we're buying. We want the really, really bad things that might happen, even if it's with a low probability. We want to buy insurance against that. And so I might want a slightly higher cost of carbon in order to account for to buy some insurance. But yeah, figuring out what is the cost, maybe buy some insurance. So it could be $100 per ton or $150 per ton. And that's what we should set it at. The response that firms and consumers have to that incentive is going to reveal to us the benefits of polluting, right? Like the reason why we're on a fossil fuel based economy right now is because fossil fuels offer incredible amenities. And, we're moving to other technologies that are either more expensive or offer less amenities. And so, setting that price right is going to allow the market to tell us, what we should continue to do and what we should not continue to do. The last part of your question was, should we exempt electric vehicles from the carbon tax? And absolutely, we should not do that, because what we want to do is make it much more expensive for electric vehicles to operate on coal-fired electricity than on hydroelectricity, right? Or any other carbon-free electricity. We want that carbon tax to be associated with all carbon emissions, including ones that are electricity related.
And then next one would be, is the trend of EV being an additional vehicle and not a replacement vehicle, is that consistent across all income groups?
That's a really great question. I don't have the answer to that. That graph is from work that we haven't published yet. We're still analyzing the data, but I think the one thing I will say is the market share of Teslas is astronomical. And what that shows us is what we already know from looking at things like the NHTS and the Consumer Expenditure Survey, which is that most people who buy electric vehicles are wealthy. And most people who buy Teslas are wealthy. So I would suspect that result is an artifact of having wealthy multi-vehicle households buying electric vehicles. If lower income households who only have one vehicle are buying electric vehicles, it might be more of a substitute. So I think you're definitely onto something. We don't know the income of the households in our study. So we would have to do a little bit of fancy footwork to try to estimate that. But I think it's a great question, and we're definitely going to look into that.
We have time for just one last question. One point, would it be at what point would it be appropriate for governments to issue mandates versus allow the market to evolve on its own pace?
So I again would encourage you to refer to that paper if you want some more detail, but basically you only want to mandate something if it's obviously the superior technology, and almost everyone already acknowledges that it's the superior technology, so it would have maybe an 80 or 90% market share, and the people who are not buying it, who are not adopting it, are making mistakes, right? For some reason they're not fully informed, and so then you might want to mandate it to get from like 80% to 100% or 90% to 100%. But that's not what we're looking at with gasoline versus electric vehicles. Anybody who's talking about banning electric vehicle or banning gasoline cars at this point, or mandating electric vehicles, that's just like politicians, talking. That's only ever going to be feasible if EVs are actually dramatically superior to gasoline cars, which currently, they're obviously not.
Thank you so much, Professor Rapson. Unfortunately, we are currently ending our webinar because it has come to that point, and I just would like to say thank you, Professor Rapson, for joining us and talking about the intended risk of current electrical vehicle policy. Let me see. And before we end, I would like to thank Evolve Houston again, who has been our partner, has been sponsoring these webinars. And please join us next month, September 30th. We have our next webinar with Professor Bruce Reyes, who is from UFH, and he'll be here from 12 to 1 p.m. So don't forget to register. You guys should be getting emails as soon as after this webinar once we have the page live. He'll be talking about the pilots for equitable electric mobility. Once again, thank you, Professor Rapson. Thank you all for joining. Without you guys, this wouldn't be possible. So thank you, and have a wonderful rest of your week.
Thanks so much, Saad. And thank you, everybody, for the great questions. Those were really excellent questions.